where you have national industrial and educational policies that are part of the welfare state that kind of supports the idea that, while we are competing about our comparative advantages as national economies, we're committed to the idea that global growth is also possible, right? Or is this going to produce the kind of, a version of competitiveness that is highly interested in a really flexible labor market, a really flexible set of capital markets, in which a highly integrated global economy involves a lot of kind of beggar thy neighbor style competition over a bunch of skills in the knowledge economy, right? That they're having a debate over what this discourse could mean. And that's what that internal link argument is about. If this plan is connected to the social citizenship tradition, it might be possible to imagine the use of competitiveness that supports a relatively equal economy. Sean's, the whole premise of Sean's link and internal link arguments is that's not possible. This force of competitiveness will end up producing, through its rhetorical and larger institutional effects, a highly unequal, structurally violent economy.
I have a follow-up question. Which card did Shrew read that said the way he uses the discourse of competitiveness can lead to an extension of equal protection? Part of the reason I'm asking this is because Shrew reads cards that are both competitiveness as a theory is true and competitiveness as a discourse is good. So both it's good to talk in this way, or as a rhetorical formation it's important, but also as an actual set of policies, protectionism and all can sometimes be useful. Which card is talking about the rhetorical tropes? Well, I guess for starters, does everyone understand how those are two different arguments? What's the difference between those two things? Between saying competitiveness is good and the rhetoric of competitiveness can be important for driving activity.
One of them just saying like the theory itself is necessarily good, or the theory itself is good in practice, and then the one where it's the rhetoric is saying talking about these things or using them as the basis for our decisions is also good.
Okay, so the card that says it's useful to talk about these things says even if it's not true, talking in terms of competitiveness can drive us to do things like funding education. Does anyone know which card you read that said that? Yeah? I don't think so. Yeah? Nope, I believe that's a card that said abandoning rhetoric's lead to neoliberalism.
I didn't catch the name, but it was the one that talked about healthcare and income taxes and specific.
Yeah, there's that blue card and then that West and 12 card. I'm just pointing this out because it's a different type of competitiveness good argument that disagrees with the rhetorical strategy, not just is this thing true or not. And those are two different important strategies that Shrew has set up in the 2AC.
I want to discuss a concept that gets used a lot by affirmatives in critique debates that I think we want to think a little bit about in terms of the way it fits with the negatives type of argument. Okay, and that is the language of inevitability. How did the AF try and use inevitability here? Where did they make inevitability arguments?
They said that it's inevitable that institutions will act as if competitive theory is true.
Which institutions?
Like globalists.
Let's sharpen that a little bit. Who is the AF saying will use the language of competitiveness, whether or not we agree here that competitiveness is. Okay, so one, the AF made a claim about academics, that a large number of academic studies and academic disciplines will continue to be highly national in their approach. Now that doesn't mean nationalistic necessarily, right? We're not talking about a bunch of like sociologists sitting around going like USA all the way, right? It's instead that they would start out with a study of the US as a unit. Okay, the idea that methodologically we will start with some national bodies for understanding what's going on in the world. So that's a claim about academics. That's one place where they use the language of inevitability. What's another place where they did it? Okay, so work versus the post-work society, right? How did Shrew do a good job of like Did he just read that set of cards about the post-work society? I felt like there was a transition there that was significant. What did he do to set up that set of evidence?
You also said it turns to alternative.
Yes, but how did he do that? I agree. He made a good, like a powerful claim about the effect that it has on the alternative. He quoted their evidence. He quoted their evidence that says a society based on the commons would be a post-work society, or at least that's what he said that it said. Right? He said use that quote to say this links you to a bunch of these other things. Okay? And then read cards about those. Affirmatives, take note, right? It's not just kind of like don't know what the alt is. You read their cards. It's like reading a counterclaim text, except rather than reading the alternative text, because oftentimes that's not particularly helpful, you read the alternative cards and tried to use some of those cards to make some link arguments. What are the other inevitability arguments that he made? I think there's one more that we're missing.
Just before the global Partners Act was issued, as countries are driven by self-interest and not inevitability.
Yes, this was what I was demanding some more precision from Arnott about. Okay, the nation states that national policymakers will use the language of competitiveness in describing their economic options. Okay, now we're going to do the sort of next step here in terms of conceptual explanation. Sean's arguments about discourse or about rhetoric, the rhetoric of competitiveness. What is the way that you could explain, quote, inevitability in rhetorical terms? This is a tough one. You're heading into some undergraduate and or graduate education here to try and make this connection, but I believe that we can get there. What does inevitability mean if Sean is right and we're debating about rhetorical effects? What does this inevitability thing mean? Why is that important? Why might it be relevant?
Rhetorically, it's relatively that we can frame things in our mind and we can speak about other types of policies.
Okay. What does that say about how we would persuade people? Why?
Because it's inevitable, so we use the same in order to justify anything.
Okay, so notice we now also have two competing theories of persuasion. Right? The AF says we should use language that people are familiar with, some languages that are dominant, or to use one of our fancy jargon words, hegemonic, that is used by a large portion of the population, oftentimes with some degree of voluntary, like no one is out there making everybody speak this language this way, right? This isn't like the Soviet Union. It's not the case that it's like, oh, you'll be sent to jail if you don't talk about the world in terms of competitiveness, right? So it's hegemonic in the sense that something that's happening voluntarily. People accept the idea, it's become an accepted idea that competitiveness is important for our economy, okay? So the affirmative theory is we should use, because it is the case that millions of people and some important policymakers and all these institutions are using this language, if we're going to go persuade those people, we have to use some of their terms, okay? What's the negative theory of persuasion? What's the obligation of the person trying to do the persuasion? What's the negative saying we should be out there doing? Should we be using the existing languages? What should we be doing instead?
Creating new ones, like using language of
Using the language of the commons. Okay, I'm going to tweak that just a little, not just community, but the commons. That is, we need a new economic rhetoric. We need a serious transition in how we think about what the economy means and what the economy does, right? Think about that in terms of the human capital argument, right? It's one thing, if we're saying to everybody out there, it's like, basically education is a form of improving human capital. People are they're part of capital, they're part of the way in which we understand economic value right now, okay? Their sets of skills they should all be understood as contributing to capital. Does the negative agree with that understanding of what people are and what they're doing? Does the negative agree with that explanation of what people are and what they're doing? No, they do not, right? They have a different understanding of what it means to be a participant in an economy because they have a different understanding of what an economy could be, right? Something organized around the commons would be really different than something organized around national competitiveness. So I want people thinking about that because this is a way that both the affirmative and the negative can make arguments about the effectiveness of the advocacy without using only the language of fiat. An argument about persuasiveness is an affirmative and a negative strategy that goes beyond the question of fiat. Because persuasiveness asks how and why we should advocate for something, not just whether or not it would be a good idea to have that thing happen.
Just FYI, all might still want to be taking notes on this stuff. It's not like these arguments are, that Turner is saying, are like things that everyone knows. I would say a good amount of us don't know. But walking around, it looks like 2 or 3 of you are taking notes and more of you are trying to click on the games on your phone. So.
Okay, so the order is going to be whatever of the K that the 2 NC cover. Okay.
We need a new sheet of paper.
I mean, I would flow it next to what you said because it's only going to be responsive, but you can put it on a new sheet if you feel more comfortable.
Okay, your debate, so you tell us.
Oh, no. Just float straight down. Okay. I think you're trying to sit down with it.
No.
Okay. Is anybody not ready?
You should imagine the discourse of competitiveness being like a snake eating its own tail. The problem with competitiveness is that on the one hand, it involves a defense of economic interdependence, but on the other hand, it involves an extreme defense of economic nationalism. These two things cannot be squared and produce a series of contradictions, including the confusion in cross-examination. If you're wondering why I was asking Sri the questions that I was in that 2AC cross-examination or why it was so confusing, it's because competitiveness theory doesn't make any sense. It involves a basic contradiction at the heart of it that means the first part of the affirmative doesn't make any sense with the second part. I'll explain why. Competitiveness theory says that there are companies that are globally mobile that can choose any country they want to locate in. That's why we need a more educated workforce. That's their internal link evidence in the second card in the 1AC. At the same time, workers that are highly skilled are also totally mobile, which means they can go to different countries and countries can attract them by offering them things like membership in the community or citizenship. This means that there's a constant race to compete between different countries to attract these companies. That leads to things like regulatory rollback. If you want to get a company like Microsoft to come to your country and allow them to dump e-waste, you have to roll back environmental standards. If you want to convince ExxonMobil to be able to operate in your country, you have to roll back the corporate tax rate. This means that there is a constant process of regulatory rollback, a hollowing out of the state that occurs at every level of the economic development. This occurs across the globe, not just in the United States. The U.S. is the prime mover of the international system. If we use a discourse of competitiveness, it instigates everybody else to using a similar set of discourses at the same time. It also creates an economic nationalist approach to where the workforce as well. It means that we're so scared about our workers leaving to go to the UK or France or Australia to work in the high-tech sector that we pay them more and more wages and tolerate increasingly higher levels of inequality. That's where our Brown and Tannock evidence indicates that escalating levels of inequality become increasingly untenable, but they also become necessary within the discourse in the imagined world of economic competitiveness. At the same time, in order to solve the affirmative, Sri in the short term would have to massively increase the number of H-1B workers that are coming into the United States to fill the skills shortage gap that he's described. That means that there would be taking those workers from other countries and lowering their economic potential, which means we'd be beggaring our neighbor, the classic opposite of comparative advantage theory and economic interdependence. That causes economic nationalism. It creates negative expectation, trade expectation between countries because they increasingly have to rely on things like tariffs or massive subsidies within the country in order to attract those workers. That means that there is increasing international tension and conflict. That means it's impossible to resolve any of the negative impacts or blowback of globalization within a world of economic competitiveness because countries are constantly at the same working against one another while at the same time proclaiming the value of economic interdependence and using a classic beggar thy neighbor strategy. The impact is extinction. Our evidence indicates that economic inequality leads to this classic social cohesion within nations. It causes things like racist, protectionist discourse against China and China bashing. That's what escalated tensions in the South China Sea and the root cause of conflict there. It also causes things like environmental destruction. We don't worry about environmental destruction because we're so concerned about attracting companies into the country, which means even if it's possible for capitalism to resolve climate change, which is their parenting and manual evidence, it's not possible within the discourse of competitiveness because it requires hollowing out state regulations in order to make it possible to attract workers and companies in the first place. That means they can't solve any of the impacts of the 1AC. That you should vote negative before you even consider extinction level impact, because we have one that's structured that the quality of life across the globe will be massively depleted, even if Street's able to win the affirmative leads to equal citizenship within the United States. There's no answer from the affirmative about the global inequality DA, which means there's a massive decrease in quality of life globally as a whole host of workers who are not able to get access to high-tech jobs or skills or education are treated as disposable populations. Those people are not solved by the affirmative. Even if they resolve extinction, they have no means of improving quality of life for those people, which means their calculations are necessarily racist and economically inequitable because they prioritize saving the lives of people whose lives are already good over improving the lives of people whose lives are shitty in the status quo. That is a sufficient justification for a negative ballot. Now the alternative, we should extend it. It's our Slater and 14 evidence that involves a reconceptualization of the meaning of the educational system towards the commons. This does not mean some radical post-work rejection, and it also doesn't mean a fanciful abandonment of institutions. Instead, it means a recalibration of what institutions means. We have a basic level of economic and social interdependence that we must continue to uphold and adopt. That is the alternative. The alternative eschews competitiveness in favor of economic interdependence, which means we choose one side of the dilemma that is posed of the contradiction within the 1AC. That means it's possible for us to reconstitute global institutions in the global system, but our expectation would be that the only way to do that is to have a prior level of social inclusion membership within societies that requires it being not just national, which is the 1AC, they only believe equal citizenship for U.S. students, but global, a recognition of global citizenship. So we're promoting international institutions based on the idea of things like basic worker protections, based on environmental protections, treating those things as a commons that must be protected and held in common by everybody. The level of general intellect of the global society has to be higher. That means raising and maybe even supporting infrastructure investment in other countries, which is not possible in the world of the affirmative because they endorse competitiveness rhetoric. That means that the alternative is able to solve all of their impact arguments about all the terminal impacts of U.S. leadership as well as economic interdependence, and they're not, because they lead competitiveness rhetoric. Now, I only have 3 minutes left, but the rest of the line by line is basically irrelevant at this point. It's the overview. So, the Sayre evidence, not relevant. This evidence just says institutional engagement's good. That's what we do. We allow for the endorsement of we allow people for the endorsement of the plan based on an entirely different set of logic. The idea of full and equal participation in citizenship in a global community, not based on equal participation in a national community that would be competitively situated against other countries. The Owen evidence, the alternative in the framework argument is not about a prior question. It's simply the argument that the plan is framed according to discourse. The 1AC is only plausible because they have created an imagined world in which it makes sense. You should vote negative. If we went to their political imaginary is bad, that doesn't preclude the possibility of engaging in institutions that are already proven. So their Owen evidence doesn't link this. Cameron and Pollan and Forrest stories become common sense because their constructive social theory should be considered storytelling. This implies generation of social theories as a dialogue which takes place in interpersonal and interinstitutional narrative constructions that can no longer accept their insights to the realities they seek to describe. In the case of globalization, this emerging narrative serves to suggest a limited range of plausible implications. The reflexive plans is necessary. Many social scientists shy away from the beliefs of mutual causality. Globalization opens to a multiplicity of spatial domains characterized by different modes of social being and identity. Imagined communities giving way to a series of imagined economies which maintain the fiction of the state situated within a radically different set of boundaries. The prevailing areas of political action are changing through the production of the particular imagery of globalization. This means that the negative framework is the only middle ground because it involves evaluating both the plan and the advantages. They simply ignore the discourse they've used to defend the 1AC and move the rest of the 1AC other than the plan text, which just on its face doesn't really make any sense. They say floating picks are a voting issue. First of all, laughable that it's a voting issue. Come on. Second of all, it's not a floating pick. Counter-interpretation. If we clarify in the cross-examination that we can do the plan without the advantages, then it's not a floating pick and it's legitimate. And we've explicitly stated it's a key test of justification because it's a key test of discourse of the 1AC. This means in order to win this argument, Sri has to first win framework that the question of the debate should not include questions of discourse. Otherwise, it's severance and heals to a bad model of debate because it excludes the possibility of engaging discourse, which means we can't think about the justifications that are used, and that leaves us blind to the possibilities of possible negative implication of future action. Now, initially reading as an impact doesn't solve because A, with a negative would be A, and uniqueness, and B, because it'd be contrived, because it forces comparisons between institutional versus non-institutional action that are not within the literature base. I've already proven that with my extension of the alternative above. Now, he says liberalism, he says lack of U.S. language skills versus U.S. unipolarity. He does not, I have not read a single card in the 2AC that answers the two critiques of hegemony that were read in the 1AC. First, Foster says that all of their impact scenarios by lack of collapse of leadership and hostile rivals are ideologically constructed. It has been conceded that the media is controlled by private interests and institutions. People like Fox News whip up a frenzy about China. That's a byproduct of economic competitiveness discourse, which makes us think that we we are competing with jobs with China rather than economically interdependent in a global society. That's the root cause of SCS conflict. It makes collapse of unipolarity inevitable because it makes it impossible to build alliances and bandwagon proven by our American first rhetoric, causing tension with countries like Germany and other countries in the European Union. Makes collapse of U.S. unipolarity inevitable anyway, and it also means their representation should be treated as false. Second, our Nixon DA says that U.S. leadership leads to rollback of global environmental regulations. That's proven by U.S. withdrawal of Paris and effects on Paris.
Okay. So when you're describing your alternative in the big overview, you sort of say that we should sort of look at a political economy that's not based on competitiveness, but just sort of looks at economic interdependence.
Yes.
Is that accurate? Okay. How does the alternative convince people who already believe in competitiveness?
There actually really aren't as many people as you're saying believe in competitiveness as do.
So our hope is that they don't exist. That's the
Well, I think it's equally plausible to say that many people believe in economic interdependence. Paul Krugman's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he thinks competitiveness theory is bullshit. He's not the only person. He's a columnist for the New York Times.
Which people who have political influence and money believe that competitiveness is not a thing?
All kinds of people. Like a lot of the people who are in like Silicon Valley don't think competitiveness is a thing. They think economic interdependence. Yeah, they think
Folks
economic
still know
interdependence.
that.
Well,
They don't think competitiveness is a thing.
Some of them think it is.
They have startups that are trying to compete with other companies.
Yeah, they think
around
companies
the world.
compete, not countries.
Okay.
That's completely plausible.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the framework code about storytelling, etc. Why is sort of the negatives political imaginary able to create things like sustainable ecological behavior?
Well, I don't know why you keep saying ecological being. Like,
Because that is a quote in your piece.
Yeah, but it's not really the way that I've been describing it, and it's not really the only.
So your evidence, is distinct from how you're describing
No,
it.
you're just taking one particular term that's used at one point.
Yeah, because that's the solvency mechanism
Well,
for the environment.
no, it's not.
It's not.
I just give you the whole overview. What you call the big overview, I think pretty clearly explained the context in which I'm reading the evidence. The whole part isn't about being and ontology. The part's about educational institutions and whether they're in favor of competitiveness or in favor of something other.
What does the alternative do about educational institutions?
So the alternative could allow for 14th Amendment like clarification about education. We're not saying that that's bad. We're saying the rhetoric that you're using to defend it is bad and has a bunch of negative implications.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the impact claims you're making about things like environmental deregulation would occur as a result of the competitiveness rhetoric. Why is that true?
It's empirically proven that countries sell off like fishing rights in order to try and compete. They sell off, they roll back their environmental regulations in order to allow other
And that's
companies
that's
to go-
because the word competitiveness was used, not because
the word was used, because policy was calibrated to the assumptions of competitiveness theory. Not because somebody one time somewhere said the word.
Okay.
Because policy was constructed with a particular imagined reality in mind.
Okay, lastly, let's sort of talk about sort of the social inequality and the structural violence impact arguments that you're making.
Yes.
How does the alternative, for example, begin to provide anything for example, differently raised populations that you're talking about?
Well, so the alternative would be about treating other countries' populations and their level of education as being important to the U.S. The U.S. and those
Why
countries.
don't you do that as well?
Because your app says that we need to outcompete those places and have smarter workers so we can get all the jobs. That's the premise of why competitiveness is key to economic power.
Great. No, I would quickly start prepping it to exceed 5 there.
I think I got to 6.
Okay.
Exactly.
Is that exactly right? 6?
As much as, for the next couple weeks, I'm going to be teasing Sean about his 2NC coverage here. I think that there is actually some very wise choice making going on in terms of how to make this set of arguments. Okay. I want to draw out a couple of things. First, this overview. I will say, I would. Were this me, the one thing that I might have changed about this is not giving the overview. It's that I would have said, take out a new page to flow this overview. Okay? I would have said that. But that aside, okay, so I've got my, here's my first page of my flow of this critique. We're going all the way down to basically the bottom of the first page of the overview. So that's why I would have wanted a new page. Anyway, okay, aside from that, notice some of the things that are going on in this overview. Okay. First, it is full of story. It adds depth to 1NC evidence. It does not extend each 1NC card and just like, oh, all I'm doing is just saying that the 1NC has a bunch of evidence in it. Notice, it also does not use a set of impact comparisons that are rote or robotic. It doesn't say structural violence outweighs on magnitude and probability, right? It doesn't, it tries to make the story of this criticism his own. I hope, and I suspect that this is the case, it's like you picked up on the fact that that makes for some pretty compelling listening, right? Like, if there's one thing that this overview is going to force you to do, it's listen really carefully. Like, you're getting basically a history lesson in political economy and a set of arguments about the implications of that history and its possible effects. Like, this is stuff where I'm sitting, you know, I even know, like, I've talked about this with Sean a million times and read a bunch of these cards and right, and I'm still sitting there like, oh yeah, like, this is pretty interesting. Like, I'm drawn into this speech rather than put off, okay? And I think I want to highlight that for the way that we think about what it means to debate some of these large critiques. And that is that this is a presentation of this criticism that is inviting. It attempts to draw you into a bunch of complicated concepts rather than using them to push you away, to imply that no one could understand this and this is some arcane knowledge that, you know, only people who spend their entire lives talking about ontology could possibly understand, right? I think it's an attempt to persuade, not an attempt to just present. And that's really something that I want people to pay attention to, because I think that that is something that's significantly undervalued in the way that we have this style of debate. You know, like, even in the process, you'll notice, rather than when Sri asks him the question about, you know, environmental being, he doesn't take that as an opportunity to say, like, yes, well, being capital B, of course, in the question concerning technology is footnoted in this, right? He doesn't talk like I would. He instead asks you to understand that this means some more practical things. The curriculum in our schools could change. We would have national standards, but the things that we would be teaching people might include some things about environmental interdependence, might include ecological economics. Instead of learning about your AP economics class where all, you know, it's like GDP is bad. We should be thinking about indexes of well-being. We should be thinking about ecological footprint. There's all kinds of stuff that you could be learning in school that would be really different in terms of your understanding of what the economy of the future is going to look like. And Sean tried to draw us back there instead of using the word being or the word ontology to have this discussion that would instead be very off-putting except for a select group of people. Okay? So I think that that's something to pay attention to. Also, even given this very large overview, what does he do next? Thank you. The line-by-line arguments are still referenced, and they are all explained in light of the overview, right? There are a few places where he can make, like, one shorter argument because he's already explained a lot of the background to that argument to begin with, okay? So he's using the overview well to support line-by-line debating rather than using the overview as a reason not to debate line-by-line. Those are two really different approaches. And it's just like he's thinking about the way he's going to set up his line-by-line arguments instead of just like, line-by-line, who's ever heard of any of these cards? Okay? Another thing, how does he split the block?
What's splitting the block?
Dash.
Depending on how you're going to like which arguments you're going to take in the toting webinar and how to allocate your time that way.
How did he do that here?
We spent a lot of time like selling the story on the impact level debate, and then spent like I think he said 3 minutes or something doing like answering the first 6 arguments.
Okay. How do you often see people split the block now when reading one critique? Okay, so taking like K versus case. Notice, has the negative dropped the case? Jake is nodding. No, I do not think the negative dropped the case, right? There's a lot of in-depth debate here that concerns the case and the relationship between the alternative and the case. It's just happening on their own sheet of paper. We'll have a conversation about that later. Yeah?
Webinar takes this time.
Yes. Please don't just automatically have the 1NR take the perm, okay? Like imagine, just think about this. Think about covering this 2AC that has more than 20 arguments in it if what the 1NR does is takes the perm and theory. Like, the 2AC has like 18 arguments to answer that. Not a reasonable expectation, and certainly not something that's compatible with actually explaining the kind of story of this criticism in any kind of depth, okay? I would not ever just, the 1NR, they should read blocks. To me, this is backwards, okay? The 1NR is the time, because someone has more prep, they have more opportunities to read affirmative evidence in depth to determine whether or not it applies, to think about their approach, not just to read a block, right? If what you're doing for 8 minutes is just sitting there tildeing blocks into your speech document, that's not very high regard for what the 1NR is capable of doing, okay? So don't assume it's just like, yeah, 1NR, perm, theory, they're going to read their conditionality blocks, they're going to read the perm block that we formulated, 2 months ago when we were first writing this K. It really underutilizes a lot of the ways in which this position could be split.
The other big issue with that is the 2NC overview here, which I also think is a little long or whatever, is largely an explanation of the case. The overview is largely just case related and the interaction between the case and the critique. Because in order to be good at any of these sets of critiques, what you really have to be good at is explaining why the case is wrong. And why the way they're explaining some fundamental assumption doesn't make any sense. Which Sean is very good at. And then he uses that when he gets on the line by line to be like, say your card, irrelevant. This has nothing to do with our criticism. And explains why. And it allows you to frame the rest of the line by line through, this is what the app's about and why we do or don't have to answer this set of arguments. And then explain that in context. If the 2NC is just like, I'm going to go lightning fast and answer all the arguments without talking about the app at all, you're going to be like, what do these things have to do with me? So at least Sean gives us a good amount of context at the top of what it's about. I do think maybe it's a little much, particularly because almost every single argument he makes answers to basic number 5. So he could have just been like, basic competitiveness theory true, and then give this whole rant.
Yeah.
So whatever.
That's okay.
The other thing I really wanted to point out, though, was in CrossX, Shri is asking a few pretty open-ended questions, which normally we would maybe say is problematic, but I think he has a very clear laid out strategy. So there are 2 in particular questions that he keeps coming back to. The first one, how do you overcome all of these people who don't believe in competitive, or who believe competitiveness is true? What do you do about that? Which Sean is like, what do you mean? Those people don't exist. And the second set of questions that he's asking are like, oh, so all of these national policies were just created by someone using the word competitiveness? To which Sean has to answer, no, it's an ingrained ideology that people keep using. So Shri is going to make some decision on this balance that is, how can it both be true that this is a fiction that no one believes in, and that every policy in our national history has been based on it if no one believes it? He's going to want to play with that and decide either, I'm going to say everyone believes in it, and that's a reason that we need the affirmative, we need our discourse, competitiveness is good, or people don't actually believe in it as a set of permutation arguments that he can make. We'll see which way he decides to do that, and Sean, maybe paying attention to the 2NC, is going to build some of those arguments into the 1NR, answering this kind of double line he was trying to set up. So I think that it is worth noting, even when he's asking pretty large, like, well, explain this thing questions, why he's doing that. It's not like where he doesn't know what's happening in the debate.
Yeah. Last kind of thing to mention here. Crap, what was I going to say?
I'm going to say another thing about Crossix, sorry.
Yep, you do that.
The other thing about Shri is he clearly had an agenda in Crossix. He brought up a piece of paper with him that had some outline of what he was going to ask about, and you could tell when he was asking, he was pushing Sean on to get some explanations, then he heard what he wanted and he moved on. So he's like, here's the question, I want them to answer in either A or B, I have a strategy for either way, because they have to make one of those 2 answers, and then I'm going to move on. I'm not going to keep beating a dead horse, or being like, but Sean, the alt doesn't solve. Sean, the alt doesn't solve. This is stupid. What's the alt? No. He asks it, he gets the answer, he moves on.
I remember now. What's the one card that Sean read?
At like the 14 card talks about
Okay, yeah, great, good summary. Like, why is that the one card?
I wouldn't be surprised if that's the only card in this block.
Okay.
But
Why is that the place where we read that card? It's not short either.
If you really want his framework to win, then his framework is right, then it can take out a lot of like the other like, then it can mean that the links are true. It can also take out a lot of like Shree's answers on all solvency and such. So that like winning your framework on this is thinking about the discourse of the plan and how you form the plan is more
What's your name?
on it.
Anna's going to give a good 2 and R for this debate. Okay, she's paying attention. She's following what's going on because he's reading evidence that is about his theory of competition. I don't mean competitiveness. I mean his theory of competition in debate. Right? These arguments about how we should evaluate whether or not the plan is the focus of the debate, is the larger advocacy instead of justifications the focus for debate. What does the negative get to do in relationship to those things? Can the negative include the plan? Yes or no? Like, those are key questions that are very important for, at the very least, they're very important for determining how both sides explain their strategy. Okay? And there's a good chance that if the affirmative commits to making this debate about theory or about a theory of competition, that, you know, that's a place where the negative wants to have at least one additional card from what they had in the 1 in C, right? What's the other kind of just like, in thinking a little bit about this, okay, and this is some other kind of strategic level thinking, okay? Why does Sean feel pretty confident that if he reads that card, or if he reads a couple cards on this issue, because there's at least one in the 1 in C as well, why does he feel pretty good about his explanation of this critique as potentially including the plan? Why does he feel, because it's like, he's made a big strategic bet, right? Like, this is the way that he's explained the alternative now. Why did he feel okay making that bet?
Because he's arguing that the affirmative can still happen. We just need to reorient the way that these competitors view.
Okay. Now notice, is Sean saying that if, quote, the affirmative happened, does that mean that the alternative produces a world in which the U.S. is focused on producing primacy in competition with other countries? Is he arguing that just like, oh yeah, the case doesn't matter because the alternative solves it because we do the plan? No, he is not arguing that, right? I think, yeah, it's good that people are picking up on that, right? Why, in terms of the evidence that he's reading, what's the AF evidence on this issue going to look like? What's the best affirmative card that you can imagine to answer this argument?
I guess he has the only way for institutions to coordinate all.
Yeah, like honestly, the best version of the affirmative card here is the arguments that we were talking about in terms of persuasiveness, right? And using the language of existing institutions and using some of those existing discourses. Okay, I think you're right about that. Notice, the best card here isn't going to be a card that says that discourse, justification, story, etc. don't matter. I can tell you, debate, there's like a million debate coaches out there who have been hunting for or searching for the best possible card that they could find for this does not matter or this is irrelevant. What they have produced so far is it's bad. Bad. Like that is just a place where the affirmative evidence is not good. Like take a look in some back file that you have for what you think is the best card that says that discourse is irrelevant or that language doesn't matter. Okay? I can pretty much guarantee that you're looking at a card that's not too great. Okay?
That includes the exact opposite.
Or that's from someone who's like making a caveat to their position that actually these things are important. They're just not the only thing that's important. Like just not a great which is the negative's argument. So it's like that's not a great place to be in as the act. That's something to think about when it's like, okay, the negative chose to read their one card there, and I think they feel pretty confident that having one or two cards there is sufficient to give them a good chance to win the debate. on that issue.
I was watching the fastest one in our average is going to cover 20-something arguments.
Wow, hot calling kettle on that one. That's exactly what I did. Okay, so the 1 and R is going to start where the 2 and C ended, which is, as has been pointed out, number 5. So that was the end of explaining the Nixon card. Okay. Everybody ready, or anybody not ready?
It's starting on 2AC number 5.
What's up?
It's starting on 2AC number 5.
Yeah, it's starting on 2AC number 5, or sorry, 2AC number 5. Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Okay. Everybody ready?
U.S. international leadership is not necessarily bad, but it's a question of how it's framed. If it's based on the idea of competitiveness, the U.S. using leadership in order to extract rents and get advantage for itself, then that's bad. That's what our Nixon evidence says. It says that that leads to a mentality in which the U.S. becomes the insular, only thinks about its own interest, it's an epistemological blind spot because we're not able to see all of the people who are the compact of leading the disposable populations that are outside the view of Americans, and Americans are not able to advocate on behalf of people outside of the United States. That leads to environmental racism causes, climate change and extinction, which means it'd be better to not have leadership at all than to have leadership based on competitiveness. The alternative solves that because it leads to leadership on the basis of cooperation and cooperation to reconfigure the way the U.S. leadership works. Additionally, they say liberalism on the brink of competitiveness causes right-wing takeover, plant impacts, and 16 citizens to become new discontents against neoliberal policies. Examples include Brexit and Trump. Concerns about human costs of neoliberalism on working class citizens are results indicating consistent negative relationship between neoliberalism and labor rights, openness to global trade investment are becoming by reduced production for workers. These results support the raise the modern dynamic performance system, which will go about business, friendly environment, important key part of increasing active commitment to neoliberal policies, emphasize price stability, social stability, imposes downward pressure on wage levels and environmentally organizations, minimal states necessary is less able to protect rights. We offer support for sufficient regarding market-friendly policy. States need to take active steps to ensure that liberalism is not supplanted by neoliberalism. You should also extend our piece of our Heartland evidence conceded in the 2AC. It says that comparative advantage theory is wrong because we don't have full employment in the status quo. The social costs of carbon are not internalized. Both those things require state regulations and competitiveness rolls back. That's the overview. Means that their arguments about why liberalism is good are epistemologically flawed. All their models are based on the assumption that they're doing the things that the alternative does. Now, extinction outweighs. I've already answered that argument. The overview competitive is good. The knowledge economy argument, the athletes to a knowledge economy divide because their claims about automation are first world perspective. Our evidence from Roulette in 14 says that there's statistical evidence indicates that most people are in agriculture or heavy manufacturing across the world. The argument I made above about them only helping people nationally, not globally, links to this argument. They say realism. They say realism states acts as competitiveness is true. Even if you should prioritize questions of desirability over feasibility, even if producing the common sense like you believe in the possibility of real utopia as a prerequisite to reform. Bullet right 9. What is pragmatically possible is not fixed independently of our imaginations. Believe utopian ideal may be necessary to motivate people to leave the status quo. Social arrangements are not immutable. Conservatives have argued grand designs are always disastrous. Right? Fundamentals say this is a wholesale redesign. This is the grasp of humans. This is not being detailed blueprints. Keeping some devices advanced believe in impossible radical terms played an important role. Keeping every political life. The political space for social democratic reforms was expanded because more radical options and capitalism were seen as possible. The political conditions were progressive, tinkering, dependent on the presence of more radical visions. There was an ideological restriction of grand designs even by the left. This cynicism weakens progressive political forces in general. Additionally, shift to the commons is emerging now. Salami in 17. There's no doubt neoliberalism is in decline. People are being thrust into the hands of greedy hands of private firms as a result. The electoral coalition that voted for free market capitalism is voting to escape it. On this point, to the need for radically different governance, we need something that both retains social and health services, the environment, cultural works, and shared ideals, and transforms human psychology by acknowledging our dependence on one another. It would not be a mere reshuffle, but a completely different perspective where assets are managed in a way that benefits all. Might sound unrealistic, but in fact, the commons providing links. There are many examples of existing platforms such as Livio, Bangladesh, and FarmHack, and Anonymous, all over the world. People are getting together to ensure shared resources remain available for the common good. That answers the next argument that institutions act as if competitiveness is true. That's not necessarily the case. Some people believe in competitiveness theory. Many people do not believe in economic interdependence. All the evidence trees reading is from an American perspective. You should also discredit it because this prior to the election of Trump, which means that their evidence is overly sanguine about the positive possibilities of competitiveness. They see the plan is to take from the scope as it leads to social safety net, and that's also the little piece of blue evidence they read group that I've already answered above about why would not lead to social safety net. At best, their affirmative leads to equal funding, but that causes a net decrease in funding because the 14th Amendment ruling that they would lead to overturns Rodriguez, which is the only thing that their evidence is talking about. That's the 14th Amendment ruling the Supreme Court had in 1973 that just would eliminate property taxes, which means as a basis for school funding, which means they lead to a net decrease in the overall amount of funding. Additionally, the spills over arguments answered that's not solved by durable fiat because it's about things that are external to the one they say neoliberal feels too abstract. That's the argument above. It's concrete in the context of competitiveness. Their evidence is only about sweeping indicts of neoliberalism, not not about specific indicts of theories like competitive states and neoliberalism leads to right-wing takeover. That's the evidence I read above. To anti-liberalism collapse, liberalism collapse DA, the permutation, you can group it under parentheses evidence. Doesn't make any sense. This evidence is about why we need short-term solutions to solve climate change. The ask about a short-term solution involves educational, long-term perspective. We're talking about people in middle school who would be able to solve warming in the long term. That's going to take 20 to 30 years. The alternative is a better way to deal with it. The permutation, you can group two permutations of any of them or anything other than permutation. Do both their intrinsic or separate bad makes the absolute target. The permutation obviously fails to solve the link or evidence in the context of competitiveness. They say conditional alter voting issue counter-interpretation. We get test in, test up. That's key of counter-interpretation. We get one conditional alternative. That's key to test the affirmative. That's 2AC. Structural advantages. They get to first time speech. You get infinite prep time. They get to decide the topic of the debate. It's key to test their discourse as well. That's the argument I made on Floyd Pitt's theory. They say competitiveness leads to cooperation, empathy. I've answered that argument in the overview. They say the permutation solves. That's Kelty. Kelty's not writing in the context of competitiveness theory as a justification for 14th Amendment and equal protection. Neither is Liu. So you should discredit this evidence. They say a leaked question. Group all that evidence. I already won that right-wing takeover is inevitable. The comments is coming now. I know you should preface desirability over feasibility. So the next four arguments don't matter because the evidence and the work argument doesn't matter.
Cool. So, one question I have for everyone is, why could Sean cover all those arguments so quickly in the lineup? What made it possible to do that? Yep. You had to group a lot of them, because you could point out similarities or reasons that they didn't assume what he was talking about. He already had done so much amazing explanation in the 2 minutes. Like, I was giving him a hard time earlier, but I was mostly just joking around with him. There's so much good explanation early on that being able to go through these arguments quickly and say, well, here's what answers this, here's what answers this, here's a bunch of explanations we've already done, becomes fairly possible for him to do. And he honestly has some very good explanation for a lot of those ways.
I want everyone to take like a minute and a half, okay, to either circle or write down some numbers, whatever method you want to use to indicate to yourself which arguments you would extend in the 1AR. Okay, I'll give you another 30 seconds. Okay. Before we take a little bit of a sample of what some of the ideas that people have are, I wanted to note that grouping arguments is not the same thing as ignoring them. Okay? The way in which the grouping in the 1R happens is to be sure to have a short reference to the argument, right? And to effectively group a category of argument. So like, how did that happen at the bottom? Sean's running out to, I think ideally he probably wanted to get there with a little bit more time, right? He's not like, we've all of us slow K debaters have been there, where it's like bottom of those flows oftentimes gets a little short shrift. But like, what did he do there? He sees that he's running out of time. What does he do? What do you do? Because this isn't premised on the idea that everybody's always being perfect. It's what do we do, and sometimes we have things that work. I thought you were saying.
You group the terms and just have a universal interpreter.
Okay, so
What makes him so comfortable being able to group the terms? And being able to answer the permutations quick?
That's really good work on it.
yeah, right. Like the portion. If the affirmative extends a permutation, what are they making the debate about? In this case, what are they making the link about? More, I think, actually, than the initial link. Yes, there will be obviously a lot about competitiveness. What are they making the debate about if they go for a permutation? Because they're not saying, the reason I push back a little bit on the link, I know a permutation is an argument that challenges the link. But let's think about it this way. Are they going to be extending a permutation where they say, the AF has nothing to do with competitiveness? No, they're not going to be extending that argument, right? That makes no sense in terms of the way that the affirmative set up their strategy so far. So let's think a little bit, like what would they be talking about a lot? What are the substantive concepts that the affirmative has for addressing that question of mutual exclusivity? Social citizenship, like that positive rights tradition, the spillover arguments, the ways in which this is about the social safety net, those would be one of the ways that they would do that.
The same arguments that Sean makes about the plan being able to exist in the role of the alternative, in addition to the plan being in the direction of the opposite.
Right. The strategic benefit of the neg having narrowed down the difference between the alternative and the case in a few places is that the AF kind of, if they wanted to, one of the avenues they could pursue is, well, if some of these things are so close together, we can incorporate a lot of those things as well, right? What argument, if the AF did that, what argument would the AF need to win, or what argument would they need to spend a lot of time on explaining in order to set up that permutation? What category of argument would they be thinking about a bunch?
That their representations and discourse are
Okay, this is where, what do you mean by good there? Because sometimes when we use the language of good, bad in some of these big debates, we're like losing a little bit of precision. Do you have an idea in particular?
Inevitable and necessary.
Necessary to do what?
Or to be able to solve the impacts in the long term.
Close. I have a slight disagreement with that.
Like that competitiveness is like true, and then it's more likely to convince people to move in that direction rather than the all.
It would have both elements of this is an accurate description of the world, okay, or an accurate set of theories, and an argument about kind of it is necessary to persuade people. Which one of those arguments might be more important? Which one would you spend more time on if you were extending that permutation? Why? They said persuasion. Why?
It also means that when you make the argument that all fails, you can use that argument too. In addition to that, only the firm is going to be able to solve them.
Great, right? It's going to be combined with a set of arguments about the difficulties that the alternative will have changing this very, it's like the permutation there is going to say that the alternative is too much like trying to steer the battleship of the global economy, right? It's just like, it won't be able to turn around quickly enough. It's just too big. There's too much going on. The rhetorical dilemma is too large. And so the permutation is a better approach because given the way that it could persuade some of those people who are currently, in power, and it could be persuasive to a larger public in a way that some of the alternative could not, okay, you would need to combine those arguments, right? So they can't go for the permutation alone. They can go for the permutation in combination with at least one alternative fails argument. And I agree that I think persuasion would have been an important argument to explain in terms of the permutation. Does the app have to extend the permutation here? No, they do not. I agree. Good call. Okay, we'll sort of see whether or not they choose to include it. If they didn't, what arguments would get more time? So where would some of the time that would be explained on the permutation, where would some of that go if they didn't choose to do that? I want to hear from someone that I haven't heard from yet. Take a lead. Jacob.
Just defending competitiveness as a theory.
Well, so it would clearly involve a robust defense of competitiveness. What would you add to that?
I make it
Right. You would want to have a set of the impact arguments that are about the ways in which competitiveness is important for the ways in which neoliberal capitalism might solve a bunch of problems, right? The AF read some impact arguments about that. Would you include some alternative arguments in there too? Yeah, for sure, right? You would. Because that's part of the defense that you can play against the negative set of impacts then, is that the alternative can't resolve some of them. And then you have a better hope of doing so. So these are some of the combinations that are possible. Now, look real quickly at the arguments that you thought the 1AR might extend. Does it match at least one of those strategies? Okay, if you're nodding your head, that's pretty good. Okay, if you're like, uh-oh, that's some thinking that you might want to do then about how the 1AR makes some choices about what to extend. Last little thing about the 1 in R, right? I would say that the 1 in R understands that, and the block as a whole also anticipates that these are a couple of the possible affirmative strategies, right? The way that the block coverage works, the negative also has some arguments set up against both of those major categories of affirmative offense. He was very careful to do so, even if some of the cards, so for example, what in the persuasiveness category, what's the argument that Sean spent a lot of time on? And this is connected between persuasion and alternative solvency. What argument did Sean spend a lot of time? So desirability, feasibility got another card, right? Which all of the people who were saying the app is going to include at least one section on the alternative, right? That